Thank you so much, Mr. Tamminen, for that excellent talk. I feel more motivated than ever to work for our climate. Okay, so our next panel is entitled Decommissioning Issues and Logistics, and I'll be moderating this one as well. However, I am dying to watch these presentations. They're fantastic. So I'm actually going to sit down while the presentations are going on so I can see them, and then we'll join us back for questions. So if y'all want to introduce yourselves and then give your presentations in maybe order of Ms. Reheis-Boyd, and then Mr. Byrd and Mr. Poulter.
Sure.
And then I'll join y'all back for questions in a bit.
Okay, great. Thank you. Now I know when they said these lights are bright, they are really bright. Yeah. Well, good afternoon, everybody, and I'm Cath Reheis-Boyd with the Western States Petroleum Association. I've been with WSPA, as some know us by, for 32 years, 40 years in the industry. And so I've seen a lot, appreciated very much Terry Tanneman's comments. We go way back, as Gary and I do, as Tom. This was like coming back to a reunion to walk in this room. And that was really actually very exciting, and why I accepted coming as well, because I was very involved in this conversation way back when. And also, I was extremely excited to see the Marine Protected Areas brochure, because as I was talking with Laura and Kyle at my table, I was appointed to the MLPA by Secretary Chrisman of the Resources Agency way back when, and spent 8 years, Tom knows this well, as we went up and down the California coastline to set up marine protected areas. And that was over an 8-year period, and it's just so rewarding to come into the room and see what we were able to do to set up these marine protected areas. So that was also great. So just my background, Cal Poly San Luis Obispo, my degree's in natural resource management. So this is wonderful for me to re-go through all of the biology and all the wonderful information. And I would just say, just as comments as we get into this, that I truly believe in an all of the above energy strategy. I do believe we have to diversify. I believe, as my members do, that this is a really important conversation that we're having today. And it's been wonderful to learn so much new information. And I'm very happy to hear how everyone is so grounded in facts and science and really exploring and understanding the complexity of this issue, so that we can figure out what that path forward is. And hopefully, as Terry said, it won't be, Gary, in another 10 years, we'll be having the same conversation. So anyway, I'm excited to be here, excited to happen. I know we'll get into more conversation about what I think we could be doing going forward in a pathway, but I'll reserve that till after we get through the panels. So thank you.
I'm Robert Byrd, or Bob to most of my colleagues. I was a founding partner in a company called Twatchman, Snyder, and Byrd, which was probably one of the first companies, engineering and project management companies, to specialize in decommissioning. We started doing decommissioning in 1987. The company today is TSB Offshore. We continue to do decommissioning. We performed a number of the studies that Bessie and Mahoma, the former Mineral Management Service, use as their reference points for decommissioning cost and process. And I guess I've been looking at the California platforms since 1994, almost as long as Simon. We've been at it for close to 30 years, and it's amazing to me how little has changed over that period of time. And I'll talk a little bit about that in my presentation, but I'm very happy to be here this afternoon.
Oh, are we?
Introducing.
Oh, just introduce you. Okay. I suddenly realize I'm 30 years older than I thought I was. Simon Poulter with Padre Associates. I'm an environmental consultant. About 25, almost 27 years ago, I got a call from Chevron to do a presentation to them about the potential of abandoning 4 platforms off of Carpinteria and Summerland area. And that started a long career of me taking things down more than anything. In my presentation today, I'll kind of go through the California experience and see how that applies moving forward in the future. because I kind of noted that the first panel was scientists, the second panel was regulators. And I take the science information and I take it to the regulators and I say, here's what we want to do, and this is why we're doing it the right way. And I think the dialogue today, as Bob alluded to, really captures some of the key elements of a discussion that's been going on for a long time and some experience that we can now apply moving forward. So Bob, you're on.
Okay, I'll start my presentation, and if they'll put it up. They asked me this afternoon to talk to get into the nuts and bolts of decommissioning a little bit. And so I'll start off with that kind of a review of the technology and some of the details associated with offshore platform decommissioning. And then I'm also going to be giving parts of a presentation which had been prepared by John Smith, who was supposed to be on the panel today, but was unfortunately not able to attend. John has spent many years with the Minerals Management Service and then with BOEM. And he prepared a presentation to kind of update the status of a lot of the existing Pacific OCS platforms. And some of that was done this morning by Teresa Bell, so I'll kind of skip through parts of that. But we'll go through that again and hit some of the high points. So if you can give me my presentation. Oh, sorry. Okay. So like I said, this is a presentation that's prepared by me and John Smith. And the topic is going to be it's going to be looking at decommissioning basics, a review of the OCS platforms, existing platforms, operational status, decommissioning outlooks, and then some of the decommissioning challenges associated with these platforms. First, let me just look just a little bit, and I don't want to assume that you people are not very familiar with offshore platforms, but I'm sure that there are a few people who may not be. So just to cover the nomenclature, when we talk about most of the offshore platforms, not including the islands, but the typical jacket-based structure consists of a topsides, possibly a drill rig, but possibly production equipment, quarters, a deck, and then the jacket, which provides the support structure, and then generally a pipeline connecting the facilities, and depending on the platform, you're going to have wells, and which are put into the soil through conductors. And so this schematic kind of shows what a general offshore platform would look like. And when we talk about decommissioning, the things to really be concerned about are the wells, of course, and then the topsides, which have to be removed, and then, of course, the jacket, which has to be disposed of, and then, of course, pipelines and electrical cabling and so forth. Looking at that process, this slide shows basically the complete cycle that would be a decommissioning project. Planning, and lots of planning, permitting, inspections, well P&A, platform preparation, pipeline P&A, conductor removal, topsides removal and disposal, substructure removal and disposal, subsea equipment removal, and then finally site clearance and remediation. Now, there's a lot of permitting issues that really kind of go along with all of these various phases. But this is what the cycle of a decommissioning project would look like. Now, Teresa showed earlier a schematic of a well, but this is a little bit more detailed schematic. And one of the questions, I've been given copies of questions that people would ask, and one of the questions, well, what happens if something goes wrong in a well? Will a well repressure, or will the reservoir repressure? If you look at the schematic, the basis of plugging wells is a concrete or the cement plug at the bottom in the production zone. And I'm sorry I don't have a pointer here that I can point to, but basically on both of these schematics, the two schematics shown here are what a rigless and a rig-based well P&A would look like, and they're almost identical. The only thing different is the one on the right, where you use a drill rig to do the P&A, that more of the tubing is taken out of the well than would happen if it were rigless. But the essential elements of any P&A is going to be a bottom plug, where a cement plug is squeezed into the formation, an intermediate plug, which is in the caprock, which forms a secondary barrier, and then a top plug, which seals off any tubing or casing that may be left in the hole. And then everything above that top plug would be cut and removed, typically at about 20 feet or so below the mud line. Now, the next phase would be conductor removal. What I'm showing here in this slide is a conductor that was cut with an abrasive cutter. There are a number of different ways of mechanical, abrasive, explosive severance that are used, but today almost everything would be done with an abrasive or a mechanical severing system. Explosives are possible, but not likely to be used rather here in California on the West Coast. Deck removal, the deck would be, once the wells are plugged and conductors are cut and severed, the deck would be the next thing to come out. And the previous picture showed a very small, simple platform, but if you look at the platforms here on the West Coast, most of them are modular. All of your relatively newer and larger platforms would have been built with modular topsides, which consist of a lower module support frame, an intermediate support frame, and then modules of various types that would be placed on top of that. And as far as decommissioning is concerned, you would basically reverse that process to take the topsides off. Now this is showing one of the possibilities for jacket removal. Jackets, if you think back to the initial schematic I showed, the jackets are basically a structural steel frame that are pinned to the bottom, pinned to the sea bottom, with piles. Piling would go into the bottom 200-300 feet perhaps, depending on the soil conditions. And the piles have to be severed in order for the jacket to be lifted off. And this is showing a picture of explosive severance, which is possible, but again, not very likely to be used in the context of the West Coast. Today, abrasive and some mechanical cutting systems have evolved to the point that they're very reliable, and the piling will most likely be severed using an abrasive system. And this is an abrasive cutting system, which is for very large piling, lowered down through the piles typically by a derrick barge. Sorry, let me go back. All right. Jacket removal. And this is showing about a 200-foot jacket being lifted onto a cargo barge for transport. Jackets up to about 200 feet are possibly going to be lifted out in a single piece. 200 foot is about the limit of what you can do in a single piece lift, depending on the marine equipment that's available. A small deck and jacket being transported together. Again, these are a jacket that's less than 200 foot water depth and a relatively small deck. For larger jackets, the top sides would be taken off in a conventional lift, generally multiple lifts. And then the top portion of the jacket would be severed to the extent of the capacity of the derrick barge that you're using. And typically, the derrick barges that would be available out here can lift 2,000 or possibly 3,000 tons. Sometimes, we have derrick barges, I'll show you some pictures of them, that are much bigger than that, but typically 2,000 tons is about what you can lift. So the top piece of the jacket would be severed and lifted, and then you go through a series of cuts and sectioning of the lower portion of the jacket. And depending on what type of marine equipment you have available, typically the jackets would be cut up into lifts that are in the order of 500 to 1,000 tons maximum. Once you get down to the base of the jacket, where the heaviest portions of the jacket are the bottom third. The bottom third of a jacket carries about 2/3 of the weight of a jacket. You get down into because of the limitations of the marine equipment. You get down to the point of not being able to lift much more than about 500 or 600 tons. So you have a lot of sections, a lot of pieces that have to be cut. And again, this is just a different, well, no, this is a severing of topsides if you're going to be leaving the remainder of the jacket. For example, a reef in place. This is what would typically happen. You cut the braces off of the center sections of the top portion of the jacket, and you cut and remove the top pieces, unless you're able to lift the entire section off in one piece. Just again, illustrating the reef in place, what would happen, removing the top bit of the jacket and leaving the bottom portion in place. And then these are pictures of some of the marine equipment that you would be using. This is McDermott's DB50. Then we have two of the intermediate, what are now intermediate sized derrick barges, Hermod and Balder. These are Dutch-based systems where most of the equipment is based out of Rotterdam. And then two of the larger systems that are currently in operation, Saipan's 7,000, and that's the derrick barge on the left. It has two 7,000-ton cranes, and then the Herma's Theof, which also has two 7,000-ton cranes. So total capacity, at least for a surface lift, would be about 14,000 tons. Pipeline decommissioning. Pipeline decommissioning would it's fairly straightforward. Pipelines in over 200 feet of water would typically be left in place. Inside of 200 feet of water and in state waters, the pipelines would be cleaned, flushed, and then removed into shore, unless there is an environmental reason, for example, that you wouldn't do it. But otherwise, they would be cut and removed. And the cables, same is essentially true for power cables. These power cables would be removed in total from all of the platforms that are here on the Outer Continental Shelf. They would be cut up in sections and removed. One of the main issues in terms of decommissioning off California is what to do with the material. And I think Simon will be able to speak. Simon's actually been responsible for one of the few platform projects that has occurred in California, but material disposal is a real challenge. And I'll talk a little bit more about that in a second here. Okay, we did, some years ago, we did a major material disposal project for one of the operators that had five large platforms that they needed to remove. And I and one of the operator's engineers surveyed all of the facilities, starting with National Steel down in San Diego, all the way from the Mexican border up to Seattle, Tacoma area. And we looked at the old Long Beach Naval Shipyard. We looked at Hunters Point in San Francisco, the old Kaiser facility at Vallejo, and old naval facilities that were in the Seattle-Tacoma area. We found that there was only one site on the whole West Coast that was big enough or capable of dealing with the five platforms that operator wanted to take out. And that was a facility that was controlled by Schnitzer Steel in the Portland area on the Columbia River. And they had about 350 or 400 acres of property that they could use. We based for that operator, we based our removal and disposal numbers all on that particular facility. Unfortunately, when the project was ended, the operator discovered that it had been an old naval shipyard and that it was polluted and was a superfund site. So they concluded that they would not bring any of their material into that particular site because of the fear that they would be picking up a liability. So our conclusion was that there's just simply no facility. There is no facility on the West Coast in the U.S. that would be able to handle a large decommissioning project of multiple platforms. We looked at SA Recycling at that time in the LA Long Beach Harbor. Again, Simon's more familiar with them because they were the ones who did Chevron's 4H's, or at least a predecessor facility to SA Recycling did the 4H's disposal. We also looked at a certain point at the Baja Peninsula. Back in the late 80s, a construction facility was designed for about a location about 15 or 20 miles south of Tijuana on the coast, and it would be possible to build a recycling or disposal facility in Mexico, but the politics of that are considerable, and the operator that we were dealing with at the time thought that was way too complicated. So we're left with a situation today where there just simply isn't anything on the West Coast that you can rely on for disposing of the large platforms. Now, shifting gears and going into the presentation that John Smith had prepared. This is just a map of the location of all of the platforms on the California coast, starting up with Irene to the north, and then going down to the Edith, Ellen, Ellie, Eureka, and the Beta unit down on the southern end. And Teresa had shown this slide earlier, or something similar to it. All right, now, looking at the details of oil and gas production over the last 20 or 30 years, this drawing shows gas and oil production in California for the last 20 or 30 years or so. And you can see that in recent years, on the right-hand side of the slide, oil and gas production in California has basically dropped off to almost zero. There still is some production, but it's very, very low compared with the historical. Now, looking at the platforms themselves, this bar chart shows the age, or the older than age in years of the various platforms. And on the left-hand side, all the platforms left on the California OCS are older than 30 years. 11 of the platforms are older than 40 years, and 5 of the platforms are older than 50 years. Now, looking at size, this drawing shows a comparison of sizes of various things. If you look on the left-hand side, the 120 feet was the deepest of the 4H platforms that are the actual platforms that have been removed. 500 foot is the world record, or was the world record as of the end of last year of platforms that have been completely removed. 500 foot is the largest one that's ever been done. The Harvest platform is 675. Gale is 740. And the Harmony platform is almost 1,200 feet. So all of these platforms, all of the large California platforms, would set new records for complete removal. The Empire State Building on the right-hand side there, the 1,250 feet, that's the Empire State Building, just for comparison. Now, I know you can't really read this, and Teresa had shown some of these details, but this is a listing of all of the platforms in California and their status. Most of them, there are only 7 producing platforms out of 23. Only 7 producing platforms remain. Now, the shut-in platforms are shut in for a variety of different reasons. Some of them, the reservoirs are played out. Some of them are shut in for pipeline issues. A number of them, in fact, are shut in for pipeline issues. But out of the 23 platforms, we have 7 producing platforms. I will leave it to others to speculate about when and if the shut-in platforms are going to come back into service. But right now, I wouldn't bet on it one way or the other. Now, it was mentioned, Teresa mentioned this morning of the projects that are currently underway. There are a total of 8, I think, decommissioning projects that are currently in the planning process. The 5 Chevron platforms have been in the planning process for quite a long time. I think I would say more than 20 years. And then, of course, we've got the other platforms, Habitat, Hogan, and Houchin, which have all fallen out of production and have been designated to be shut in, or removed rather, here within the last few years. And so this is where we stand. We've got total of 8 platforms that are in the process or in various stages of being decommissioned. Okay, California decommissioning challenges. There are a number of them. Large structures and limited water depth experience in the industry. As I said before, the largest platform that's ever been completely removed, is 500 feet. So you'd be setting new records with many of the offshore platforms here. Almost a complete lack of local infrastructure. There just simply are not locations for disposal. They're not contractors. All of the major marine contractors that would come into projects here on the West Coast are coming out of either Singapore or Rotterdam, and possibly Gulf of Mexico. But even in the Gulf of Mexico, we don't really have the large marine equipment that you would need for these particular platforms. Very large mobilization costs because of the location of the equipment. Very limited onshore processing and disposal options. And then finally, a problematic rigs to reef legislation. And beating on the disposal option a little bit more, and I've gone over most of this, but basically there just simply isn't anything available for the disposal of the material that would come out of these platforms. Looking at the 4H platforms, back in 1996, I think it was, it consisted of about 10,000 tons of material that was brought ashore. Gale and Grace would be 50,000 tons. The Point Aguayo, the 3H platforms in Point Aguayo would be 90,000 tons total. So many times more than the previous experience here. And even beyond just the raw weight that would be coming out, these the pieces of the platforms that would themselves require a huge amount of space. We had calculated for the 5 Chevron platforms that we looked at years ago that we would need about 350 acres of shorefront property in order to be able to dispose of those platforms. So it's a major real estate problem. Reefing challenges. I'm not going to get into this. I think we've had enough discussion about reefing, but reefing, one of the major problems that the operators have here is a workable reefing process. And until that happens, it's my view that you're just simply not going to see the platforms out here come out. Most of the OCS platforms, here summarizing, most of the OCS platforms have reached the end of their economic life. Between 2025 and 2030, at least 10 platforms are projected to be decommissioned. Upcoming projects will be world-class in scale. Full removal will present major engineering, environmental, and material disposal challenges. Reefing of jackets would reduce the challenges, but is problematic currently as a result of AB 2503, which I'm sure some of you know what it is. All right. And this is a a photograph that I kind of like to end presentations of California decommissioning on. This is a picture of the Harmony jacket being loaded out onto a launch barge, and the arrow points to a human being walking alongside the jacket. And I like to show this slide just simply to point out that these jackets are beyond human scale. And most people don't realize that. You know, people talk about complete removal of these jackets as though it would be something that you could just do. Well, it's my opinion that it's not doable, not right now. That you can talk about getting rid of the jackets on the horizon, but today, I don't think it's technically feasible to remove the large jackets. And when I say large, I'm saying starting at about 200 foot. 200 to 300 foot, maybe, depending on what the operator and how the project is organized, you might be able to take those jackets out. But I submit, and I've worked on this problem for longer than most people, that you can't take out the large jackets. Today, it's technically not feasible. And you will never get an oil company executive signing off on complete removal of these jackets. It just won't happen, because you can't put a cost to it today because of the permitting requirements, because of the marine equipment requirements. You, and I say me, no one can put a cost to complete removal of the large jackets. And as a result, you'll never get an oil company executive signing off on it. It'll never happen. So that's all I've got to say.
I'll let you go, Charlie. Okay, I'll
Could I have that change?
Yeah, got it.
How do I follow that?
I don't know.
Okay, I am following that, unfortunately.
Well, you know the history.
I'm going to bring things a little closer to home, and I'm going to be a little quicker through some of these slides than maybe some of you would like, because I think some of the pictures are worthy of looking at. But I do want to kind of capture the fact that California has some decommissioning experience. We have some lessons learned, and the regulatory process that is more my focus is something that we are prepared to start addressing those issues. So basically, learning from the past to improve the project implementation is in the future is what I'm really trying to focus on here. Because actually the state has led the decommissioning efforts so far in the state. California State Lands has been the lead agency from the vast majority of the decommissionings. There's only been one so far in federal waters, which was the Exxon offshore storage and treatment vessel, which was located off of platform Hondo. And so State Lands has really been the lead in understanding what the California process is going to be like. And listed here is a number of projects that have occurred over time. You know, added to it, you heard Jennifer Lucchese talk today about Rincon Island and Platform Holly. And whether the state likes it or not, they're going to continue to be in the lead on the issues that are going to be addressed eventually in the offshore OCS activities. So with that, I mean, the poster child of California decommissioning projects was the Chevron 4H. The H is for the names of the platforms, as you can see. These were some of the first steel jacketed platforms ever installed in the world, let alone in California. 3 of them were the same design. The legs were used to float the jacket out. The other had some large caissons that was also used. We went through basically the first CEQA review of the platform decommissioning issues at that time. And during that, the operations as outlined here were shut down in 1992, and by the time everything was said and done in 1996, the platforms were completely removed. And those of us that have continued to work in the background know that that hasn't really closed the book on these platforms due to some environmental issues associated with it. CEQA and the permitting issues are kind of outlined here. You know, what do you do with the various components? We have a vast amount of data that has now been generated since the 4-H platforms were removed. There was a long discussion about reefing those jackets. And one of the chief components of that argument against that was, well, these jackets only attract fish. They don't produce those. I think as you've heard from the earlier parts of today's presentation, the science has supported the fact that these structures do present a true resource to California. And whether you look at them strictly as a refuge, prohibiting commercial fishing around them, or they're in fact producing young of the year and continuing to produce it, they are key structures in that. We also had to look at a variety of other issues. I mean, yes, explosives were used on the 4-H platforms to sever the piles. Yes, it did have fish kills, but the technology has advanced greatly since then, and now mechanical cutters, as has been reviewed earlier. Here are some pictures. These actually demonstrate, the picture on the left is actually from the application that was filed with the State Lands Commission. And I'm glad to say it actually looked like it when we actually did the project. The pictures actually really happened. I do want to emphasize that derrick barge you're seeing in this picture is much smaller than the ones that were just shown in the previous presentation. Bob brought out the big guns, and in fact there is even some larger pieces of equipment out there. This also kind of points to the scale. Even though the last picture Bob showed in his presentation showed a human standing next to the Exxon's jacket, there is a human in the left-hand picture next to the caisson that is part of the 4-H platforms. Those caissons were abandoned in place because they are filled with concrete and rock, and it was basically technologically impossible at that point to take them out without having significant environmental impacts. You also heard about recycling of steel and the very smelly problem that presented itself when the jackets were brought into the harbor up in LA. The marine growth did represent a considerable issue and resulted in a lot of debate about whether that will ever be able to happen again. The other one that had got probably the most local interest was the Belmont Island project, which parallels the Rincon Island project that is ongoing, as you heard from Jennifer earlier. This was just off of Seal Beach. This was a very early production platform. It was basically a big metal ring that had rock around the outside of it, and then filled with dirt, and over time they added additional pieces of the facility to it. That facility was installed back in the early 50s. Production ended in 1995. We started the abandonment and permitting process. By the time we were all said and done, it was 2002. You might note that there is a slightly longer permitting time frame, and I think we heard earlier in one presentation a 5 to 10 year timeline for potential decommissioning is becoming more and more a reality. These more earlier projects went through a much shorter period of time. Here are some pictures of Belmont being decommissioned. You can see that you're basically working out of real estate over time. I am standing in that lower picture on what is left of one of the small jackets that was next to it. It got very small out there very quickly. In addition to the Bessie Bohm and state lands that you heard, and Cal Fish and Wildlife, there are numerous agencies that are going to be involved in future decommissioning projects, both on the OCS and in California. All of these agencies have a role to play in these discussions and are going to be part of the programmatic EIS review, as well as the feasibility studies that are going on for Rincon Island and for Platform Holly. I also wanted to add that, the key environmental issues that are on the table and have been discussed through many of the environmental documents that have been prepared so far for decommissioning have been addressed by a variety of projects. how the jacket is going to be decommissioned and disposed was, the 4-H's and Belmont kind of set the pace for what we are looking at. Shell mounds is an issue from some of the older platforms that are in shallow water that were installed prior to the Clean Water Act, when overboarding of drilling waste was standard practice. Air emissions is going to be a huge issue. One of the key points that I will make in my final slide is that the equipment necessary to remove the larger platforms, the jackets, the ones offshore here, it doesn't occur here. They are no derrick barges that big. They're going to come from the North Sea or from Southeast Asia. The greenhouse gas issues and associated with bringing a vessel from that far away has to be addressed in any environmental assessment. Hard bottom and nearshore impacts, that's rocky substrate. Part of the reason these jackets are so important environmentally is we do not have a lot of rocky substrate in the offshore areas in this area, and that is important for marine wildlife. Biological issues associated with both the structure itself and the activities that occur. As you've heard again, we're looking at some substantial megafauna, as I like to call it, around these structures. Commercial fishing will also be a debate. If portions of these jackets cannot be removed, those areas may or may not be available to commercial fishing again, although some could argue that they actually are enhancing the commercial fishing industry opportunities. Onshore facility decommissioning also is a key issue. Each of these platforms is tied to something onshore. Their oil and gas comes to shore, and the timely abandonment of those facilities is needed. And then finally, the platform alternatives. Do we really want to look at partial abandonment? Do we want to look at reuse? There's a lot of interest in the reuse of some of these facilities as marine study areas. And I will tell you, go read the feasibility study for Rincon Island and look at the biological section prepared by UCSB. There's a tremendous marine wildlife around that facility. So I'm going to repeat some of the things that you heard from Bob in his last few slides. These jackets were installed using gravity as the way to get them in, and gravity is going to fight you as you try to get them out. Aging infrastructure, you saw that several of these platforms are 50 years older, and I'm not trying to insult anybody over the age of 50, but those of us who are know that things don't work as well as they used to. Sea state, believe it or not, it's very quiet and nice outside in this harbor right now, but if you've ever been offshore, either at Platform Eureka or around the corner at the Point Arguello platforms, you are in some serious sea states that are going to affect when decommissioning can happen. Lifting up large pieces of platform in rocking seas is a very huge challenge and will limit when that equipment can work. We do not have the equipment we need to remove these platforms on the West Coast. That means we are going to have to bring that equipment in from a long, long away. We also do, as Bob has very eloquently stated, do not have a place to put these jackets when we take them out of the water. There are not facilities on the West Coast to handle that. And I will echo other speakers that the current Rigs to Reef program is unworkable. The way it's structured, the timeline issues, the program does not exist. I mentioned that the part of Chris Potter's presentation was a little depressing, but in fact that is the reality. You really need a program in place before any of the operators are going to be willing to commit to that. And finally, that is the issue. The regulatory approval timeline process here is 5 to 10 years. And you do need to plan for that, because bringing a piece of equipment from Southeast Asia or from the North Sea is going to take months to get it here. So scheduling of that, if you cannot get timely approvals in place, may become very problematic because those pieces of equipment are limited. So that concludes my presentation. It's an interesting debate, and I'm looking forward to hearing some questions. Thank you. And
I'll just make a few comments before we get into questions. I know we talked about, certainly California is one of our largest states, but we also represent Washington and Oregon, Arizona, and Nevada. But Bob and Simon reminded me why I like this topic so much, because it is super complicated. Super complicated. But I know so is marine protected areas when we started this program, and we got there. So, but it's certainly challenging. And let me just put in perspective what else is challenging for the state of California, because I do believe, as I said earlier, in a sustainable energy future, but I don't believe it's without oil and gas. And I say that in the context of traditional oil and gas, because we have to make it affordable, reliable, and ever cleaner as we're transitioning to a lower carbon economy. But also, regulation without innovation isn't enough. And our companies are, I am so excited about the innovation that they are doing in this space, whether it's looking at wind energy or biofuels or hydrogen or renewable natural gas or renewable diesel. So excited to see, and I thought in my career, I would see 2 refineries in the Bay Area switch from fossil fuels to renewable diesel. I don't know who, I think it was Amber who said diesel was the champagne compared to bunker fuel. Well, I don't know what we call renewable diesel, which has no fossil. It's gas, grease, oil. I mean gas, it's grease, oil, components. It's nothing fossil. Now we have 2 companies, Phillips 66 and Marathon, who are completely switching to refineries. That's, to me, that's exciting. So it's traditional oil and gas making it ever cleaner, but it's also the innovation side. And I always remind folks that in California, we have 40 million people who drive 36 million cars and trucks, internal combustion engines, and we are blessed with 1 million electric vehicles, because our companies invest in many of the technologies of lithium-ion batteries and charging stations. But that's a gap between 1 million electric vehicles and 36 million internal combustion engines. So it's not if the oil and gas industry is going to have a role here, it's what role are we going to have, and we are going to be in this space. And in the marine environment, my companies, basically companies I represent, are Chevron, Exxon, and CRC. You heard a lot of other companies mentioned that I don't represent, but that are certainly in the industry in this space. So those are the 3 in particular that I represent. And I also like to remind folks, in California, we are the 3rd largest consumer of transportation fuels in the world. So to Terry Tanneman's point, we all consume the energy that we need. We're the 3rd largest in the world, and there's only 2 ahead of us, and that is the United States of America and China. So California consumers still demand that we, every day, can supply gasoline, diesel, and jet fuel to 40 million people who drive 36 million cars. So we got to keep doing that while we're talking about how we get from here to there. And that's why I love this space, because it's absolutely fascinating. And I would say the 2 areas I would, and I don't know, Lauren, if this gets too much into your Q&A, but the 2 areas that, when I looked at the questions that really hit me were, one, how do we incentivize cooperation? Like, how do we actually do that? And I think, being involved in the original legislation a little bit and through the time, I think we need to have, and I think both Bob and Simon mentioned this, and State Lands Commission, Fish and Wildlife, everybody mentioned this, we've got to have a streamlined regulatory and permitting process, because we've got to make decommissioning a positive business proposition. That has to happen. And so if we just add more complexity, we're just going to add more cost, and we need to flip the script so that these companies have an ability to evaluate the options that you're all talking about, we are all talking about today, whether it's rigs to reef or repurposing into something else. I've heard so many exciting options for these platforms going forward. But we can't flip that script if it's not a positive business proposition for these companies to do anything other than decommission. And we know how hard that's going to be. So I think our members, I know, are interested in keeping all of the options on the table. I would probably disagree slightly with Bob because I never say never. And so I don't know if they will, but I do know if it was a positive business opportunity, they certainly would. I guarantee you they would certainly look at those options. So that, I think, is really important. And the process forward, I really think the shared objectives couldn't be more obvious right now for everybody in this room. I think we're all there. We all see it. We all share it. And so I love the tribal representatives' articulation of how important it is to bring everybody together, all the stakeholders together to figure this out, because if we do, and we balance the economy and the environment and social equity and energy equity, if we do all that, we will figure this out. I agree with Terry Tanneman wholeheartedly that we can figure this out. So I think we have a shared goal. I think we need to be doing it safely and timely and in a way that's it's an incentive for the companies to look at this, and to do it in a collaborative way with all of the voices to be heard as we figure this out, because nobody has a corner on wisdom. I certainly don't. And I think we can figure it out if we bring everybody together. And this is I love this. I can't believe we're back together 10 years later, 15 years later, but I think it's great, and I think the conversation is the right one to be having. So that's it. Thank you, Lauren.
Thank you, guys. Thank y'all. There's a lot to unpack here. That was excellent. And Mr. Byrd, with the mic drop there at the end of your presentation. Where to begin? Okay, maybe let's start with, I think, a question that I had, and not to be flippant or oversimplify it, right? But with all the complexity, it's like, well, you put it in, why can't you just take it out? And there was a mention of, the gravitational forces that were used to install them. So for those of us that might be a little newer to these conversations, can we get a brief description of how they were installed in the first place and why it's not so easy to say you put it in, take it out?
You're the engineer. Yeah, the jackets were all floated in, the large jackets. Now, some of the smaller jackets would have been lifted off of a barge and set in place, but most of the large jackets, like the Harmony jacket that I showed in my final slide, and all of the jackets that are any bigger than about 300 feet would have been launched off of a special barge, a launch barge, and these are barges that have big runners that that will tilt and allow the jacket to be pulled off. Essentially, they come out with the legs, and any piling that might be in the legs and conductors all sealed, so that the jacket floats. And it will have a ballasting setup, it'll have piping and tanks and things like that, so that the jacket can be slowly rotated to upright and then sunk in place, being held by, by tugs and things like that. And it'll be sunk into this, a very, very tightly predetermined location, and even orientation. I'm very, very particular about how these jackets are put in place. And then the piling will be driven and so forth. But then the buoyancy will be destroyed in the process of running conductors, running piling. It'll no longer be buoyant. And if you looked at the jackets today, any of them, any of the large jackets, you'll be running a deficit in terms of flotation, of buoyancy, of probably 10,000, 15,000 tons, which would be, or maybe even more than that, but that would be the extra buoyancy that you'd have to apply to it to refloat it. Now, there has been a fair amount of work done on refloating these jackets. But if you refloat it, then what do you do with it? Because you can't bring it into shore. These things are 200 or 300 feet in terms of depth. And so the best that you can do, and I don't know if you even noticed one of the slides that I showed, you have a strong north to south current running on the California coast. So if you're able to refloat one of these jackets and you let it go, it's going to go to Mexico. And that would be the only thing that you could do with it. If you refloated one, float it down to Mexico, sink it, and maybe make a marine park out of it or something like that.
Like Africa.
There wouldn't be anything else you could do with it.
No environmental justice.
Did that answer your question?
Yeah, I think that answers the question. Yeah, to Simon's point, except we have some environmental justice concerns there too, but we can unpack that in a separate, discuss that later. Okay, so Mr. Reheis-Boyd, you mentioned that, in order to incentivize cooperation, we had a pre-panelist call, and one of the first things you said to me was how excited you were for this and the collaborative nature. And I think we all echo that sentiment, right? We can't all work in silos. This is something that affects so many people and groups and interests that this is super important. But I think some of just to be frank with you, some of the environmental NGO community might bristle at the thought of making what's already agreed to in a lease obligation having to be a positive business decision and incentive. But I guess the reality of that is what the alternative is, a bankruptcy, or I'm not sure. But using all of this to get to the point of looking at the liability issue of the jackets, right? I understand that in the Gulf of Mexico, the state agency, the Fish and Wildlife Agency of the state would retain the liability of the jackets. Is that correct from the experts up here? I'm not the panelists. Okay, awesome. So here, under AB 2503 in California, it currently would remain with the operator. Is that the case? But that's problematic, I understand. So can we talk a little bit about the problems at stake there and kind of unpack that a bit, I guess?
Yeah, and I appreciate the concern. I appreciate my environmental friends that bristle at many of the things we talk about around the dinner table, right? But I think before I answer that question, I think the thing I bristle a little bit with is that for those who don't know, there is no way to get crude oil to California. We don't have any pipelines. We're a fuel island, an energy island. The only way you can get crude here, which we still, like I said, have to produce, right, to fuel 36 million cars tomorrow, cars and trucks, is by either producing it here or putting it on a marine tanker for going over lots and lots of miles of marine environment from Saudi Arabia, Ecuador, and Colombia, places that don't particularly share our values and our environmental standards. And the only thing we gain from that is a loss of revenue, a loss of jobs. We actually increase greenhouse gas emissions because we're putting it on a tanker and getting it here. And we're making it less affordable for California consumers who demand that we give it to them tomorrow. So I only put that out there, Lauren, because in the broader scheme of things, as we wrestle with this complex problem, we also have to wrestle with the fact that we're producing it here onshore and offshore with the strictest environmental regulations in the world. I mean, we have more focus on reducing emissions and reducing greenhouse gas than anywhere else. So those platforms that are still in operation, I would argue if you don't allow them to continue under the lease arrangements that they have, then you are basically saying that you do support crude oil coming from places that don't share our values. You support increasing greenhouse gases. You support marine tankers in already congested areas of LA, Port of LA, and Long Beach. So I can't reconcile that exactly in my mind. And so I think it's the same thing with liability. It's however the leases were arranged, and as you've heard everyone said, it's a case-by-case basis, right? So I don't know those specifics of operators' leases and what those look like with the state agencies. They know it better than I do. But it's got to be in a way that you give operators a desire to look at these other creative options. And if there is so much liability still left on the table, it's going to limit their flexibility to find the right path forward. And so I can't give you an exact answer to the question, but I do know that if we don't figure out a positive business opportunity, that they will have to choose some path that may not allow for this great creative discussion on rigs to reef or repurposing for other things, which would be a shame, in my opinion.
Mr. Byrd, I want to revisit your kind of mic drop there, where you said that you think that realistically it's not technically feasible to do full removal on some of the deeper platforms. I wanted to give other panelists an option to opine on that if they wanted to and revisit that and see if that rings true to you as well.
I'll do one and then I'll give it to Simon. He can do. I have been amazed at what this industry can do. So that was my comment, that I would never say never, because I have seen them, like I said, I never thought in my lifetime I'd be looking at 2 renewable diesel plants in the Bay Area. I never thought I'd have companies investing in hydrogen and electric charging stations. I never thought ExxonMobil would be putting so much into algae. I mean, so I'm not convinced that it isn't possible, because I've seen technology just emerge that has surprised the heck out of me.
Can I respond to that?
Sure.
Yeah, let me just respond to that, because no. I understand exactly what Cath is saying, but I want to qualify that it's not technical feasibility is not the issue. I would not describe it that way. As a practical matter, you'll never get an oil company executive to agree to a project for complete removal today with the uncertainty. I can't tell you how many meetings with oil company management people I've sat in on where we've reviewed the process and the risk associated with cost estimates. And the risk is just simply off the charts today, because of regulatory issues, because of the practicality of bringing in very expensive equipment. The marine equipment that I showed in my presentation and that would be required has to be booked years in advance, 3-4 years in advance, and it's solid. I mean, that equipment would have a window that they're going to be in California from June to October or December or whatever, and that's it. And they move on. You know, if the job, they have a little bit of flexibility if the job runs over, but if you're not able to start work on the 1st of June and that's in the contract, those guys are going to move. And you can't, an oil company can't sign on to that. Nobody can. So that's what I meant. Technically, it's certainly possible. Practically, they won't do it.
Thank you for that. My apologies if I misstated that. I went to law school to avoid numbers, so my head's still spinning from the tonnage and the cost estimates that we have here, and I'm still trying to wrap my head around that picture of a human next to one of the platforms. Okay, we've got no time left. So for one quick last question, because I can't resist, at our prior meeting as well, a panelist mentioned to me how difficult it is to get things done in California because of the gridlock between industry and regulators and the environmental groups. Look out in the audience. We are so fortunate to have literally all of those groups here right now. If you could take one opportunity to say one thing to the whole audience in the context of decommissioning, what would it be?
Briefing.
Yeah, I think education and I think active listening. I don't think we do enough of that as the human species. I don't think we do enough of that. But I think every time, even today, and I've been in this now 40 years, I learned so much just from what people brought to the table in each of these panel discussions. So I would say we all have to keep actively listening and understanding where we're each coming from so we can do things like Bob was saying, it's not it's technologically feasible. How do we get over the gridlock? You know, and sometimes that's, politics, right? So, but as I always say, we may not share the same politics, but we do share the same future. And we do share the same energy future. So we've got to figure it out because we're not going to, nobody is.
I'm going to make it very simple. I'm a biologist. Follow the science. Do the math, do NEPA, do CEQA. We'll all get the answer and we can all make that decision together.
Yes. I love the closure with NEPA and CEQA. We love NEPA and CEQA. Okay. Well, thank you all so much for being here. It was a wonderful conversation. I know it can be tough and candid, but we appreciate all of the discussion. So help me in thanking our members.
Hey, Cath.